James Whitfield walked onto the Family Feud stage at 2:14 p.m. on October 5, 2022, pointed his finger 6 in from Steve Harvey's face, and said the 7 words that would end his marriage, his freedom, and his life as he knew it. You don't know who you're talking to. He had jumped the rope between the contestant area and the host's mark. 2 security guards were already sprinting across the floor. Steve did not step back. Steve did not raise his hands. Steve stared at James Whitfield with the calm of a man who had been threatened in worse parking lots than this television studio, and said one sentence into the live microphone that would replay on national news for the next 11 days. Son, you just made the worst mistake of your life, but your wife just made the best decision of hers. James Whitfield was in handcuffs 40 seconds later. His wife Diane was crying. Steve Harvey was not done. October 5, 2022 was supposed to be a normal taping day at the Family Feud studio in Atlanta. The Whitfield family from Bowling Green, Kentucky stood on stage left. The Brookman family, a softball coaching family from Knoxville, Tennessee, stood on stage right. 5 against 5, like every Wednesday. Diane Whitfield stood at the front of her family's line in a cream-colored blouse that no longer fit her properly. She had lost 21 lb in the past year. Her wedding ring was loose enough on her finger that she had wrapped a piece of dental floss around the underside to keep it from sliding off on camera. Her mother Eleanor stood behind her, 67 years old, watching her daughter the way a woman watches a candle in a high wind. Her husband James stood beside her, smiling broadly at the cameras, one hand on her lower back in a way the cameras read as affectionate. Diane's 2 daughters, Hannah and Lily, were sitting in the front row of the audience. Hannah was 12. She did not smile once during the introductions. Steve Harvey shook every hand on that stage. When he reached Diane, he held her hand half a second longer than the others. He had been hosting this show for 10 years. He recognized something. Diane Whitfield was carrying a secret that would soon change everything. Diane and James had been married for 17 years. The first time James had grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave a mark, Diane had been 24 years old and 6 months pregnant with Hannah. He had cried afterwards. He had said it would never happen again. He had bought her tulips and a porcelain music box that played Clair de Lune. Diane had believed him because she had wanted to believe him. And because her own father had walked out on her mother when Diane was 9 years old, and Diane had promised herself she would never put her own children through that. 17 years later, she was still keeping that promise. The price of the promise had been her life. It had started small. James took over the bank account in their second year of marriage to simplify things. He gave Diane an allowance of $40 per week. He took over the family calendar in their 4th year, telling her which doctor's appointments she could attend and which she could not. He took over her phone in their 6th year. He read every message. He listened to every voicemail. By their 8th year, Diane had lost contact with her best friend from college, a woman named Patricia Reyes, who had been the maid of honor at their wedding. James had told Diane that Patricia was a bad influence. Diane had not spoken to Patricia in 9 years. She did not know if Patricia was still alive. Diane had not been to a doctor's appointment without James in the room for 6 years. The kids had never had a sleepover at a friend's house. Diane had not driven a car alone in 4 years. Her car had been broken since 2018. James kept telling her he would get it fixed. He never did. He drove her everywhere. He waited in parking lots. He timed her grocery runs. If she came back 5 minutes late, he asked her, very calmly, where she had been. The credit cards were in Diane's name. All of them. James had opened 7 separate credit accounts in his wife's name, without telling her, and run up $43,000 in debt, across a span of 3 years. Diane had found out about it 6 months before the Family Feud taping, when a collections letter came addressed to her at her mother's mailing address. She had confronted James in the kitchen. He had told her, very calmly, that if she ever mentioned it again, he would put her on the street with nothing. She had not mentioned it again. But the real story hadn't even started yet. 9 months before the Family Feud taping, Hannah Whitfield had walked into the kitchen on a Saturday morning and found her mother sitting at the kitchen table with a bag of frozen peas pressed to the side of her face. Hannah had been 11. She had stopped in the doorway. She had looked at her mother with the eyes of a child who already knew far too much. And she had asked the question that broke Diane Whitfield in half. Hannah had whispered, "Did I hurt him? Did I say something wrong?" Diane had not been able to answer. She had walked into the bathroom, closed the door, and cried into a hand towel so that her daughter would not hear her. The next morning, while James was at work, Diane had walked into her mother's bedroom, sat down on the floor by her mother's reading chair, and told Eleanor that she did not know how much longer she could keep doing this. Eleanor had taken her daughter's face in both of her hands and said one sentence, "Then don't, baby. Then don't." Diane had applied to Family Feud that same week, using her mother's email address. She had not told James. When the producers called 4 months later to say the Whitfield family had been selected for taping, Diane had to tell him. He had said yes because of the prize money. He had also told her, the night before the flight to Atlanta, that if she said anything to anyone on that stage that made him look bad in front of the cameras, she already knew what would happen when they got home. Diane already knew. Eleanor had heard him say it through the bedroom wall. Eleanor had not slept that night. Either the Whitfield family flew to Atlanta on the morning of October 4th. The taping was scheduled for October 5th at 2:00 p.m. Diane did not sleep on the plane. She did not sleep in the hotel. She did not sleep at all. The audience that filled the studio at 1:55 p.m. on October 5th thought they were about to watch an ordinary episode of Family Feud. They were wrong. The Whitfield family lost the first round on a question about things you bring to a picnic. They lost the second round on a question about things people do in elevators. The Brookman family was up by 158 points by the time the cameras went to commercial. James Whitfield was sweating through his shirt. He had snapped at Diane twice during play, both times caught on a hot microphone. Steve had heard it. The producers had heard it. The producers in the booth had marked the time codes. In the third round, the question came up on the board. Name something a husband does that drives his wife crazy. The Brookmans answered first, then the Whitfields. James Whitfield buzzed in. He gave his answer with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He said, "Tells her she's wrong when she's wrong." A few audience members laughed. Diane did not laugh. Eleanor did not laugh. Steve did not laugh. The buzzer rang. Wrong answer. James Whitfield's smile dropped. He turned to Diane. He said on a live microphone, in front of 200 audience members and 7 cameras, and the entire production crew, "This is your fault. You picked the wrong people for this team." Diane looked at the floor. Eleanor put her hand on Diane's back. The Brookman family across the stage went silent. Steve Harvey set his cue cards down on the podium. He walked 4 steps toward the Whitfield family. He did not look at James. He looked at Diane. He said, very softly, "Mama, you okay?" Diane did not answer. Her hands were shaking. Steve held her gaze for 2 full seconds. He had seen a lot of women on his stage in 10 years. He had never seen this exact look on a woman's face. He had only seen it once before in his own mother's eyes in a kitchen in Cleveland, when he was 4 years old. James Whitfield jumped the rope. He came over the contestant line in one motion. He came at Steve. He pointed his fingers 6 inches from Steve Harvey's face. The studio fell completely silent. 2 security guards were already moving. Steve did not flinch. Steve did not back up. James Whitfield said the 7 words, "You don't know who you're talking to." Steve looked at him for 1 full second. Then Steve Harvey leaned into his own microphone and said one sentence loud enough to be heard in every row of that studio. "Son, you just made the worst mistake of your life, but your wife just made the best decision of hers." Then Steve looked past James, looked straight at Diane, and said 5 words into the microphone that ended up on the chyron of every cable news show in America for the next 2 weeks. "She doesn't belong to you." The security guards reached James a half-second later. They took him to the ground. The handcuffs came out. James Whitfield was screaming. Diane was sobbing. Eleanor had her arms around her granddaughters who had run up onto the stage. The Brookman family had moved without being asked. The entire Brookman family had crossed the stage and formed a wall between Diane and the spot where James was being arrested. The cameras kept rolling. Steve had not moved. "Don't you cut a single frame," Steve said to the lead producer without raising his voice. "Roll every camera in this building. America needs to see this." James was led off the stage in handcuffs. The studio audience did not clap. The studio audience did not boo. The studio audience sat in stunned silence. Steve walked over to Diane. He did not touch her. He waited. She lifted her face. He spoke gently. "Mama, what's your name?" "Diane, Diane, are you safe right now?" She could not answer. She was crying too hard. Hannah, 12 years old, answered for her. Hannah looked up at Steve Harvey and said, "No, sir. We have not been safe in a very long time." The studio fell completely silent. Steve sat down on the edge of the stage. He patted the spot next to him. Diane sat down. Eleanor sat down beside her daughter. Hannah and Lily climbed onto their grandmother's lap. The cameras kept rolling. "Diane," Steve said, "let me tell you something. 40 years ago, I made a promise to God. I told him if you ever get me out of the place I'm in, I will spend the rest of my life pulling other people out of theirs. Nobody helped me at my lowest. Diane. Nobody. I sat in a car for 3 years and I prayed every single night that one stranger would just look at me. Not give me money. Not give me food. Just look at me. So today, I am looking at you. Do you hear me?" Diane nodded. "You are not going home with that man. Not tonight. Not ever. You hear me?" She nodded. "I'm going to make some phone calls right now on camera in front of America because I want every man like him watching this show tonight to know that there is a country full of people coming for the women he thinks he owns." Steve stood up. He pulled a phone from his pocket. The producers were frozen. Nobody tried to stop him. The first call went to Steve's personal attorney in Atlanta. Steve put it on speaker. He told her 3 things: emergency protective order tonight, financial fraud investigation tomorrow, and full legal representation paid by him personally. She said yes to all 3 before he finished the sentences. The second call went to a private security firm Steve had used for 15 years. He arranged for 2 officers to escort Diane and her daughters and her mother from the studio directly to a safe location. Hotel paid, meals paid, security paid as long as it took. The owner of the firm answered Steve in 11 seconds. The third call was the one that broke the studio in half. Steve scrolled through his phone and found a name he had been holding on to since the producer's research file had crossed his desk 3 days earlier. The producer's research department had done a background check on the Whitfield family before the taping. The researcher had flagged something. The flag had reached Steve's desk. Steve had made 1 phone call before the taping. He had found a number. He had saved it. He had hoped he would not need it. He dialed. A woman answered. "Patricia Reyes?" Steve said. "Yes, Patricia, this is Steve Harvey. I am standing on the Family Feud stage with your best friend, Diane. She has been trying to get back to you for 9 years. She is safe now. Would you like to talk to her?" Patricia Reyes started screaming into the phone. Diane took the phone with both hands. Diane and Patricia cried into each other's ears for 40 seconds on national television. The studio fell completely silent. 2 camera operators were crying so hard their lenses were shaking. The boom mic operator had set her boom down on the floor. The Brookman family was holding each other. Eleanor was on her knees praying in a whisper. But Steve wasn't done. He turned to the camera. "Everyone watching at home, listen to me. There is a foundation starting tonight, and it is called Diane's Door. Because every woman in this country who needs to walk through a door tonight should have one waiting for her. Every dollar of my appearance fee for this episode goes into that foundation right now. And the producers of this show just told me in my ear they are matching it. And I'm calling every sponsor we have before sundown." But Steve wasn't done. He turned to the Brookman family. They had been forgotten in the chaos. He apologized. He told them they had won. He told them they had won double. He told them they were the kind of family this country needed more of. Then Daniel Brookman, the father, stepped forward and said into Steve's microphone, "Mr. Harvey, the Brookman family wants every dollar of our prize to go into Diane's Door. We don't need it. She does." The studio audience stood up. The whole studio stood up. The crew stood up. Steve closed his eyes and looked at the ceiling. But Steve wasn't done. He walked over to Hannah. He knelt down in front of the 12-year-old who had answered for her mother. He said, "Baby, look at me. None of this was your fault. Not 1 minute of it. You hear me?" Hannah nodded. Steve held her hand. Then Steve walked Diane and her family off the stage with the private security officers flanking them on both sides. He did not return to finish the taping. The studio cleared. The cameras were finally cut. The episode aired 8 days later on October 13, 2022. It pulled 320 million views across YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram in the first 10 days. The hashtag #StandWithDiane trended in 37 countries. The clip of Steve saying, "She doesn't belong to you," played at the top of every cable news broadcast for 11 straight nights. 3 U.S. senators referenced the episode on the Senate floor. 2 state attorneys general announced expanded investigations into financial fraud against intimate partners within 72 hours of the episode airing. Diane's Door Foundation launched the morning after the taping, raised $5,800,000 in the first 96 hours. The donations came from 48 different countries. A truck driver in Saskatchewan gave $7. A grandmother in Buenos Aires gave $15. A 9-year-old girl in Tulsa, Oklahoma sent Steve a hand-drawn card that said, "For the mamas," with $2.25 taped to the inside. Steve framed the card and hung it on his office wall. James Whitfield was charged with felony aggravated assault, 2 counts of identity theft, and 7 counts of credit card fraud. He was convicted on all 9 counts 6 months later. He is serving 11 years. Patricia Reyes flew to Bowling Green, Kentucky on the morning of October 7th. She had not seen Diane in 9 years. She walked through the front door of the safe house at 9:47 a.m. She and Diane held each other in the entryway for 16 straight minutes without speaking. Hannah and Lily watched from the staircase. Eleanor stood in the kitchen with her hand on her chest. 6 weeks later, Diane and her daughters moved into their own apartment, a 2-bedroom unit on the 2nd floor of a brick building in downtown Bowling Green, paid for by Diane's Door for the first 18 months. Eleanor moved into the apartment across the hall. Hannah had her first sleepover at a friend's house on a Friday night in November. Lily learned to ride a bicycle in the parking lot behind the building. Diane went back to school. She is studying social work. 1 year later, Diane stood on a stage at a national conference for survivors of intimate partner control in Nashville, Tennessee. She did not cry that day. She told her story to 4,000 people. At the end of her speech, she said, "If you are in a house tonight where you do not feel safe, please hear me. The door is not locked from the inside. I promise you. I promise you. I promise you." 2,000 women stood up. 2 years later, Diane's Door Foundation had funded emergency exits, safe housing, and legal representation for 1,470 women across 42 states. Patricia Reyes is the foundation's executive director. Eleanor sits on the board. Steve gave one interview about the night James Whitfield jumped the rope. The interviewer asked him what had gone through his mind when James pointed his finger in his face. Steve said, "I'll be honest with you. I wasn't thinking about him. I was thinking about her. I had spent the whole taping watching her hands. And I knew if I didn't say something on that stage that would echo into her bedroom that night, she might not survive the week. So, I said it. And then I made sure she didn't have to go back." On a Tuesday afternoon in October of 2024, exactly 2 years after James Whitfield jumped the rope, Diane Whitfield stood at the front door of a brick building in Bowling Green, Kentucky, with a key in her hand. She turned the lock. She walked inside. Her daughters walked in behind her. Eleanor walked in behind them. Patricia walked in behind Eleanor. The door swung shut from the inside by Diane's own hand for the first time in her life. Some men spend their lives trying to lock doors around the people they love. Some women spend their lives looking for the key. And every once in a while, a stranger on a stage tells the truth so loud that the lock just falls off. Hit the like button right now and drop one word in the comments. Free. Because somewhere tonight, there is a woman watching this video on her phone in a locked bathroom. And she needs to know what Diane Whitfield learned the second she heard Steve Harvey speak. She is not alone, and the door is not locked from the inside.